What's going on, everybody? And welcome back to the dinner table. It's always a pleasure to have y'all back here another week with me. And I'm a little sad to announce this will be my last Kai-tober Fright Fest episode. So I do hope y'all enjoyed these little Halloween specials that I've been giving y'all this month. But the case I'm going to be telling y'all about today, it came to me very early on in my podcast journey. And I just been sitting on it all year long because I just really didn't know about it. But I'm going to stop second guessing myself and just do what feels right. Now, before we get into the case, I'm going to let you know that it low-key has a lot of information. That's probably why I was so intimidated to do it. So I was able to cut down the research and give y'all really all the important details. But this case happened in 1960, so a very long time ago. So I'm not going to keep y'all waiting any longer. Y'all already know the drill. Grab y'all wine, y'all popcorn, get comfortable, and let's dive into our last Kai-tober Fright Fest case.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.
This week at the dinner table, I'll be telling y'all about 25-year-old Irene Garza. Irene came from a very large, close-knit family. She was born in McAllen, Texas on November 15th, 1934, to her parents Nicholas and Josephine Garza. She also had a younger sister named Josie, and they were extremely close, and the four of them were a pretty close-knit family. But the Garzas wanted the absolute best for their daughters, and they hoped that they wouldn't have to experience the discrimination that they faced growing up in McAllen. You see, the Garzas were a Mexican-American family, and back when Josephine and Nicholas were kids, Mexican-Americans weren't allowed to go to school past the 5th grade. So when Irene was born in 1934, her parents were determined to make sure that she and Josie would rise above the discrimination that they may potentially face. But at the time of Irene's death, the acceptance of Hispanic and Latino community into McAllen still remained very tense. The town was divided by a railroad, so the whites were on one side and the Hispanic and Latinos were on the other side. But Irene was beautiful. She had fair skin, dark hair, big brown eyes. She was a real Southern belle, and she had a gentle personality to match. And her family actually didn't stay on the rougher side of the tracks with the rest of the Hispanic community. They actually owned a successful dry cleaning business, so they lived in a nice neighborhood. And Irene and Josie attended Catholic school up until high school when they enrolled in McAllen High School. The Garza sisters were the first Mexican-American twirlers at McAllen High. I know that's right. And eventually, Irene would go on to become McAllen High's first Mexican-American drum majorette, going on to be crowned both homecoming and prom queen. And after graduating from high school, Irene went on to attend Pan American College. I think it's now called something else, but it's in Edinburgh, Texas, and she became the first in her family to go to college. While she was in school, she became sort of iconic because of her beauty and her charm and how well liked she was by everyone. But after graduating from college, she went on to become a second grade teacher at Tigpen Elementary, allowing her to be back home with her family in McAllen. And her little sister Josie actually followed her footsteps by becoming a teacher as well. And Irene was described as having a way with the children. And she also chose to work at a low-income school, often spending her own paycheck on school supplies and snacks for her students. And many of the students didn't even own a pair of shoes, so she spent a lot of time giving back to her community. Including every Saturday, she would devote her time to going to the nursing home, doing the residents' hair and their nails, and other tasks that the residents need so that they would look their best when their families came to visit them on Sundays. But y'all, this woman was like a jack of all trades. She did it all. She also became the first Mexican-American Bronco Queen, and in 1958, she was crowned Miss South Texas. Like, girl, what? But overall, everyone described her as being an inspiration to young women, young girls, and she just was poised and elegant. She just had a way about her. And not only was she beautiful, smart, talented, and Miss South Texas, she was also very religious and an extremely devout Catholic who went and gave a confession every Saturday without fail. So on Saturday, she would give her confession, and on Sunday, of course, she would attend church service. But she and her family attended this same church for many years now, and it was only about a 5-minute drive away from their home. And this girl loved to volunteer because she was also an active member of the Legion of Mary, which was a Catholic association that served the church on a voluntary basis. And that's why it came as such a punch to the gut when she didn't return home that holy Saturday before Easter. So the community pulled together to try to figure out what happened to her. And just to show you how important Irene was to the community, the investigation into her murder was one of the largest and most publicized in the Rio Grande Valley's history. And get this, cousins, rumor had it a priest was the one who murdered Irene, and a Catholic sheriff working with the church was the one who decided to bury the truth of what really happened to Irene Garza. The Catholic Church had been present in Rio Grande Valley since the Spanish colonization of the region. So on Saturday, April 16th, most McAllen residents were preparing for Easter the next day. If I don't know nothing about Catholics, I know Catholics gonna celebrate Easter, okay? So just imagine what this little town of McAllen looked like right before Easter. There was Easter eggs and baskets and chocolate bunnies that filled the windows of every storefront. So like I mentioned, it was Holy Saturday, so all the priests were preparing for the large mass the next day on Easter Sunday. And all that day, Irene had been preparing for Easter. She had been making baskets for all of her little cousins, and she even called the kids to tell them how excited she was about their baskets and for them to see them and about their Easter egg hunt. She was just really looking forward to the next day. And not to mention, all the kids in her family loved her, and she would never let them down. So later on that Saturday, Irene called her friend Sylvia to see if she wanted to attend confession with her because it's Saturday and she's not missing a confession. But Sylvia wasn't home to answer the phone. So Irene went ahead and got ready to leave her parents' house so that she can head to confession. Using her parents' car, she drives about 12 blocks. Remember, this is only a 5-minute drive. And she arrives at the Sacred Heart Church around 7 p.m. And although several people saw her at church that night putting a white veil lace over her head and kneeling to pray, no one ever saw her leave church. And Irene still lived with her parents, so when she didn't come home by midnight, they were starting to worry, and they began looking for her. So they found her car at around 2:30 a.m., still parked out the Sacred Heart Church, but there was no sign of Irene, and it was pouring rain. By 3 o'clock that morning, her dad couldn't take it anymore. So he called the McAllen police, making a report that his daughter hadn't made it home from church that evening. He also told them where he found the car parked. It was parked south of the church on 15th Street, and he was afraid that something bad had happened to her. She was the type of person that always called to check in with her parents, especially if she was going to be late. But being that it hadn't been that long at this point, it hadn't been 24 hours at least, the police told Nick to call back again if Irene didn't come back by morning. So Nick drives the car home to look for Irene while her brother-in-law parks close to the church in case she comes back. So Irene hadn't returned all that early morning, and by 7 o'clock a.m., the family was on the phone calling the police back to report her missing. And at this time, an investigation began. So once they got the car home, of course they started looking for clues or any type of detail of where she could be. Now, the car doors were locked except for the front right door, and the keys were missing, but there was no sign of a struggle. Witnesses did see Irene walking from her car into the church, and they also saw her waiting in line for the confessional. But after 8 p.m. that evening, nobody saw her again. So knowing that something wasn't right, the community immediately rallied behind the Garza family, starting little search parties and volunteering to help out in any way they could. When 2 days passed without any sign of Irene, it was starting to feel a little hopeless. But then, something was found on the west side of McAllen Road that intensified the search to find her. Her purse, one of her high-heel shoes, and her white lace veil were found along the roadside. And police theorized that the purse, shoe, and veil were thrown out the car window as someone drove the car over the back roads. And though a lot of people were calling in with some promising leads, it was also very frustrating that she still hadn't been found. But on April 21st, 5 days after Irene vanished from the church, her body was found floating face down in the 2nd Street Irrigation Canal in McAllen. And this canal was literally 3 miles away from the Sacred Heart Church. Her body was still partially clothed, but her blouse had been unbuttoned, and her underwear and shoes were missing. The autopsy of Irene's body states that her cause of death was determined to be trauma to the right side of her head, hemorrhage to the brain, and suffocation. The autopsy report also noted that she was raped, but some way, somehow, it specified that she was raped while she was in a coma. We don't know how they came to this conclusion, but that's what the autopsy report stated. So the first couple of days after finding Irene's belongings scattered along the road, her family pretty much lost hope that they would ever find her alive. At the time of her death, although she was very beautiful and social and smart and all that good stuff, she had yet to marry or start a family, and those were things that she always imagined herself doing. In the weeks leading up to her death on April 9th, 1960, Irene wrote a letter to one of her friends, and it states, quote, "I've made quite a few friends this year, and I'm much happier than I've ever been." And then she goes on to reveal in this letter that her ex-boyfriend sent her several cards and a box of chocolate for Valentine's Day. So she continues on in this letter by writing, quote, "Remember the last time we talked? I told you I was afraid of death? Well, I think I'm cured. You see, I've been going to communion daily, and you can't imagine the courage and faith and happiness it's given me." And after writing this letter, just 12 days later, her body was found floating in the canal, and her death was now being investigated as a homicide. So freaking crazy how the world works, right? So local businesses came together and they ended up donating reward money totaling to $10,000 for anybody who had information about what happened to Irene. So continuing on in the investigation, about 4 blocks south from where Irene's body was found, police found a muddy shoe print with a strand of thick, dark-colored hair stuck inside of it. And they believed that this hair belonged to Irene. And there was also tire tracks and a faint imprint of Irene's petticoat found inside the mud. During the investigation and weeks after Irene's body was found, the police interviewed over 500 people. They took statements from Irene's family and friends, as well as co-workers, ex-boyfriends, including anybody that had ever taken her on a date. But they were really looking for someone who had actually seen her the night she went missing. And over 60 people were giving polygraphs, and sex offenders all over the region were even being questioned and alibied. And despite this wide scope of the investigation, police were focused on Irene's last known whereabouts, the Sacred Heart Church. They interviewed any and everybody that was in the church on April 16th, and during the night Irene went missing, they were also able to find out that there was 3 priests and 1 visiting priest there to hear confessions throughout the afternoon and during the evening. So they took the initiative to map out the evening's entire confession lines. No, for real, it was that serious. They reconstructed where each churchgoer was standing. They had it all charted out to where everybody was standing in the church. So they even learned that one of Irene's 2nd grade students and his mother was in the church that night. And while they didn't exactly see Irene, they did see a purse that was left behind on one of the pews inside the church. So after praying, when no one still hadn't come to claim the purse, the student and his mother took the purse to the rectory and gave it to one of the priests. And the priest they took the purse to was Father John Bernard Fight. And investigators also learned that on the evening Irene disappeared, she was seen going into the church's rectory alone. Now, for those of y'all like me who aren't familiar with the Catholic Church, a rectory is where the priest or the clergyman reside, and it's usually attached to the church itself, but typically off limits to non-clergy members. So prior to Irene entering into the rectory, witnesses had seen 3 priests, not including Father Fight, returning to the church from the rectory. And none of the witnesses recalled seeing Irene return from this residential area. So while they were trying to piece together Irene's final hours at the church, they keep coming across the same name, Father John Fight. And as far as they knew, Father John Fight had been the last person to see Irene alive, because they were told that he was the one that heard her confession that night. So like any good detective, they started digging into this man's background. 2 weeks later, investigators ended up draining the canal where the shoe print was found and where they believed Irene's body was dumped. Now, as the water was being removed from this area, investigators discovered a light green photo slide viewer. And unlike the case that we discussed last week where the police didn't put out anything to the public, they were actually smart in this case and they released a picture of this slide viewer to the local newspaper and they were asking the public for help to see if anybody knew who this slide viewer could belong to. And a couple days went by and this same familiar name came across investigators' desk once again. And that name would be of 27-year-old Father John Fite once again. So he had written a note to the police saying that he was the owner of the photo slide viewer, but he didn't explain why this viewer was in the canal. So something else that's important to this investigation that they found when they drained the canal was one of those fancy candlestick holders that they came to find belonged to the Sacred Heart Church. But unfortunately, investigators didn't try to match the candlestick holders to any of the wounds found on Irene's body, even though it's a strong possibility that these candlestick holders could have been used in Irene's murder. Decades later, when an investigator asked why Father Fite had written to the police and identified himself, the detective answered by saying he believed this priest was trying to taunt police. So I'll tell y'all just a little bit about Father John Fite, the information that I was able to find. So he was born in Chicago. I don't know about his mother and father, but he did have an uncle who was a priest in Detroit. And when he was only 13, his parents sent him to a seminary in San Antonio. There he studied for the missionary oblates of Mary Immaculate. And while you're here, you pretty much just have to serve the poor and the needy, I guess until they feel like you're ready to graduate to the next level. And the next level for him was being ordained at the age of 25 in 1958. So in 1960, he started his year-long training to become a pastor at the missionary oblates in San Juan, Texas. I didn't even know there was a San Juan, Texas. I thought it was just San Juan, Puerto Rico. But anyways, he was also helping out at the Sacred Heart Church in Edinburgh, Texas, which was around 11 miles away from San Juan. And although he had been ordained at a pretty young age, when people asked him why he wanted to become a priest, he would answer by simply saying, "I just wanted to give it a try." Not because the Lord called him to be a priest or because he's seen it in a dream, just simply because he wanted to give it a try. But he was known to be a bright and well-mannered man. And all in the same breath, he was noted to be somebody who was really distant and kind of a loner. So that's pretty much all I have on this man. Now, hopping back into the evening of April 16th, witnesses eventually came forward saying that they saw Father Fite in and around the church campus throughout the evening of April 16th. But when police spoke to him, he claimed that he never saw Irene for confession that night. And despite him initially stating that he didn't hear her confession, later on in the investigation, he admitted that he was the one that heard Irene's confession, and it was sometime around 7 p.m. He then goes on to tell them that he left the rectory with her at 7:30 p.m. But after no witnesses could corroborate his story, investigators learned that following the Easter vigil, Father Fite and a couple other priests were standing around drinking coffee together, and he told them about an encounter that he and Irene had the night of her disappearance. He goes on to tell the other priests that she wanted to go to a confession in the rectory, but he told her to confess in the church. And after hearing this man's story, police didn't believe him even a little bit. Investigators went on to speak to one of Irene's good friends named Anna Marie Hollingsworth, and she tells police that during Holy Week that year, Irene had mentioned a young visiting priest who she thought was handsome. So Irene tells her friend Anna Marie that this priest, who we now know is Father John Fite, told Irene that she was too good to confess in the confessional. Instead, he would take her into the rectory to hear her confession. Now, her friend does tell police that although Irene did seem a bit confused by Father Fite insisting that she does her confessional in the rectory, she did do as she was told by the priest. So investigators are like, this man's name just keeps popping up and it can't be by coincidence. Like there's only so many people in the church that Irene could have seen. So after doing more digging into Father Fite, police learned that he attacked another young woman by the name of Maria America Guerrera. And this attack actually took place 12 miles away at the other Sacred Heart Church in Edinburgh, not in McAllen. So on March 23rd, 1960, less than a month before Irene went missing, 20-year-old Maria America was coming home from college to her home in Edinburgh, which was right across the street from the Sacred Heart Church. And as she's cleaning herself off in the outside bathroom of her home, she notices a man watching her. This man is described as having black hair and horned-rimmed glasses, and he was sitting in a blue and white 1957 or 56 car parked outside of the church. So instead of doing anything about this situation, she decides to ignore him. But after dinner, she crosses the street to go pray, and she notices that the car is still parked, but the man is gone. As she walks into the church, she notices the man who she'd seen watching her earlier sitting in the back pew. But she just kept minding her business. She walked up to the front altar, and as she kneeled down, she was attacked from behind. The man shoved a piece of cloth in her mouth, and as she screamed and kicked to get away from him, she bit his finger as hard as she could, hard enough to taste blood. The man then threw her to the ground and ran out of the church. But luckily, a witness, who was a woman by the name of Maria Christina, as you can see, they loved naming their daughters Maria back then. So this Maria heard the first Maria's screams, and she saw this man running from the church. And when the second Maria, which is Maria Christina, saw Maria America running out of the church, she asked if she was okay. But the first Maria, Maria America, just ran home. Later on that night, she did report the attack to police. And shockingly, the church officials suspected that Father Fight was responsible for the attack. But instead of turning him in or notifying law enforcement, the church's bright solution was to send Father Fight 12 miles away to the Sacred Heart Church in McAllen. Now at this church, they were supposed to be keeping a close eye on him. But in early May of 1960, when police asked both of the Marias to view a photo lineup of suspects and to help them identify who this man wearing these horned-rimmed glasses who attacked Maria Guerrera could be. And both of the women identified the man as Father John Fight. So when they go to speak to him, he does admit to police that he was at the Sacred Heart Church in Eden on March 23rd, the day of the attack. But he says that he was praying until 5:15 p.m. and when he left to talk to another church member, he said that he went back to San Juan at 5:30 to ring the church bell. But during this little conversation, police noticed Father John's finger. It had what looked to be a bite mark on it. But this man had an excuse for everything. He tells him that he had hurt his finger using the mimeograph machine on March 22nd. Now, just by looking at the two women, Maria America and Irene, they were both young and attractive Hispanic women who looked very similar to one another, and who were most likely attacked by the same priest. So investigators decided to give Father Fight a polygraph test. And during 2 days of polygraph examinations, Father Fight was deliberately avoiding clear, direct answers to questions about Irene's murder and the attack on Maria America. He was asked about what Irene confessed on April 16th, and he was also asked about scratches on his hands. So he goes ahead and pulls another lie out of his ass, and he tells him that Irene's confession had upset him so much that night that he was sweating profusely and he needed to drive around to cool down. And since he was sweating so much, he had driven to the San Juan rectory to change. But it was locked. So he decided to climb a tree to get into the second-story window. And that's supposedly how he got all these scratches on his hands. But as you could have guessed it, Father Fight failed the polygraphs. And according to the police report, in their opinion, he was responding in a manner that indicated beyond doubt that he was concealing facts and he had a guilty conscience. So not only was he a habitual liar because he just keeps lying, the Sacred Heart assistant pastor named Father Joseph O'Brien told police that Father Fight had some injuries the night Irene disappeared. He says there were scratches that ran vertically down his hands and on the tops of his arms. And not just that, Father O'Brien says that he was suspicious of Father Fight for several reasons. He goes on to say that Father Fight used the parish car many times that day, which stuck out as odd, not only because of Irene's disappearance, but also because it was Easter Sunday, which is an extremely busy day for the church. So why the hell is you round here ripping and running when you're supposed to be up there preaching the Easter Mass? And Father O'Brien says that he even tried to follow him on Easter night, but he lost him in traffic. So growing very suspicious of Father Fight and worried that something could be going on, Father O'Brien took it upon himself to search the basement and the attic of the rectory, but he didn't find anything. So, lo and behold, the next time police speak to Father Fight, he changed his story. Y'all listen to this mess. So this time around, he says that on April 16th at 7 p.m., he and Father O'Brien were leaving the rectory when Irene called and she asked to speak with Father Junius. But he was already hearing confessions in the church at this time. So Father Fight says that he tells Irene over the phone that he could speak to her, but she had to come immediately. And according to this version of events, Irene showed up and they started discussing a personal problem in the rectory so that Irene wouldn't be overheard. And it's like, come on now, dude. You took her from the confessional where she's supposed to give her confession in private to the rectory, which is y'all's personal area? All right, and what else, Mr. Fight? Okay, this next part is a little confusing to me, but this is how I'm taking it. While they're in the rectory, she's supposedly giving her confession. He then tells her to go to the church confessional. So they then leave the rectory together. Then he heads to the confessional where there's a line of parishioners waiting to give their confessions. So we're just supposed to assume that Irene joined this line later on around 8 p.m. So after he tries to alibi himself for not being with her after 8 p.m., he says that he then gets the rectory keys from Father O'Brien and he went for a break. Like, didn't you already have the rectory keys? How did you just leave the rectory? But anyways, he claims that he returned to the church at around 8:15. At around 9:50, Father Fight claims that he notices a screw fell out of his glasses. So he tells a senior priest that he needed to go to San Juan, which was about 5 miles away from McAllen, to get another pair of glasses. But when he got to San Juan, he realized that the door was locked. So he placed a wooden barricade against the wall and climbed up through the second-story window. And this is how he claims he got the scratches on his hands. He then says he makes it back to McAllen by midnight for the Easter Vigil Mass with all the other priests. His story goes and carries on into Easter Day, where he claims that he offered 2 morning masses and a late afternoon mass. And he performed baptisms in the afternoon. So he was just a busy bee all Easter Day. On Easter evening, he says he goes back to the Sacred Heart Church to pick up his suit coat and his Roman collar, which he had conveniently left behind. But very freaking crazy, while he's back at the church picking up his stuff, he sees another priest in the rectory who asked him if he could speak to Irene's parents. You see, her parents had already heard that Irene had confessed to Father Fight before going missing. So they just wanted to know if he had said anything that could have possibly upset her or anything. Just tell me something. But this man just simply said no and walked away. And according to his statements to police, talking to the Garzas disturbed him. So instead of driving back to San Juan, he drove around aimlessly for a while to calm himself. I wonder why. And even with all of these lame-ass excuses and rehearsed stories, they still didn't have enough to charge him. Instead, they decided to go after him for the attack on Maria America. I mean, they did still have 2 eyewitnesses for this case, so why not try this route? On August 5th, 1960, Father Fight was charged with the felony count of assault with the intent to rape in the case of Maria America. But when police went to arrest him, he was nowhere to be found in McAllen or San Juan. And a week later, he surrendered himself, saying that, quote, "I'm innocent of the charge for which I'm being indicted. I'm not a fugitive, nor have I been a fugitive. I'm hiding from nobody because I have nothing to hide." So when asked about his whereabouts for the last week since his arrest warrant was issued, he says that he checked himself into an out-of-state hospital because his nervous system was affected by the stress of his legal issues and speculation of his involvement in Maria's attack. And he says, quote, "I wanted to try to get some rest and get some peace of mind. I felt I couldn't take it anymore." Man, get out of here. So records from the Catholic Church did show that Father Fight had in fact spent about 2 weeks in a church-ran medical center in St. Louis called the Alexan Brothers Hospital. But he hadn't gone to this hospital to be seen for no daggum anxiety. You see, the Alexan Brother Hospital actually specialized in treatment of priests who had been sexually abusive. So in this case, the hospital decided to take in this priest, and they promised that he could remain anonymous. So after Fight made bail, he returned to the hospital, and on September of 1961, his trial began for his attack on Maria Guerrera, which ended in a hung jury. So his new trial was scheduled for the spring of the following year. 5 months later, in February of 1962, Father Fight was sent to the New Mallory Abbey in Iowa, which is a monastery for Trappist monks. And these monks are pretty much another denomination of the Roman Catholic tradition, I guess, to make it simple. So being here was the perfect place to hide. No one knew nor asked about Father Fight's past. You see, he was able to have no access to the outside world. There was maximum security monasteries, and it also wasn't uncommon for the church to send priests who were being punished to this monastery for monks. So they sent him there. So he pretty much just chilled here and laid low until March of 1962, right before his second trial. And at this time, he decides he's going to take a plea deal. So the deal was to plead no contest to a misdemeanor count of aggravated assault, and he agreed to pay a $500 fine and court fees. In exchange, the Hidalgo County DA, Robert Lattimore, and Father Fight reached an unofficial agreement. And this agreement benefited only Fight and, more importantly, protected the reputation of the church. And even though the deal wasn't in writing, the judge who was to sentence Fight for the no contest plea said that he was in agreement with the plea agreement. So with all of these unofficial plea agreements and exchanges of no contest and all that good stuff, in exchange for this plea agreement, the police and the DA's office would stop investigating Father Fight, and he wouldn't be prosecuted for Irene Garza's murder. And even though nothing was in writing regarding this plea agreement, the judge still upheld this decision, and this was technically allowed. And obviously the church supported this deal, saying that it was best for the church to send Father Fight away. So he skipped his happy ass back to the monastery in Iowa. Y'all, the Catholic Church must be stopped. So around this time, Irene's family got a visit from Father Joseph O'Brien, and he tells the family that even if Irene's killer was Father Fight, the church would take care of him. So basically, they were going to find justice within the church. And this was the biggest slap in the Garza family's face. Because what the hell are you talking about, Father O'Brien? Take your ass on somewhere. At this time, the family knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the church was working with the police. They just didn't have any proof of it. Now, during this time of church-imposed punishment, Fight was overseen by Father Joseph O'Brien, and O'Brien was dubbed the special investigator by the city manager of McAllen. What kind of shit is that? So he was pretty much serving as Fight's religious probation officer. And it's also unclear how long Fight stayed in Iowa, but according to CBS, he wrote a letter on the New Melroy letterhead on June 19th, 1962, which was still only a couple months after he took the plea deal, but the letter reads, quote, "The time has come to make some definite decisions, enabling me to begin a regular ordained life with definite goals and with a definite aim in life." And just like that, he was able to pick up and move on with his life, leaving the monk monastery in Iowa. But in early 1963, Father Fight had relocated again, but this time it was to Missouri. But he didn't leave the church like I thought he was going to do, hence this little note he wrote. Instead, he picked up and moved to Missouri to another monastery. While there, he was monitored by another monk named Dale Toshny. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm just going to call him Dale, though. And Dale was in charge of determining whether or not Father Fight would be called to the monk life. So 6 months after Father Fight had been at this monastery, Father Dale and his supervisor determined that it was safe for Father Fight to go back into the world. But by the end of 1964, Father Fight had moved to the Servants of Parcelets, which is a facility ran by Roman Catholics in Jimenez Springs, New Mexico. And this monastery was described as a supermax because this was pretty much a last resort option for priests who still wanted to stay in the church. Like, damn, y'all don't give up on y'all's priests. Y'all just keep fighting even though they're not good. Just kick him out. Goodness gracious. So Fight ended up staying at this church for 7 years and eventually joining the Servants of Parsalet's church. And within 4 years, in 1968, Fight had transitioned into the role of supervisor. So this man was just moving on up the ranks. And in this role, he actually supervised priests who had been sexually abusive and determined if these men were good enough to return back to the churches and work with children again. And during this time, he supervised more than 80 priests. One of them was the prolific James Porter. Porter arrived to this monastery in 1967, following multiple complaints of abusing children in Massachusetts. So Fight worked with Porter for over a year and a half, sometimes even releasing him on temporary assignments to churches in need of staffing, allowing this sick child molester to visit 4 locations around New Mexico as well as Texas. And y'all get this. Each time Porter was released to go work at a church, he was molesting young boys, and they were usually young Hispanic boys ranging from 7 to 10 years old. So despite knowing that he was a child molester and knowing that he was still out there molesting kids, he takes his raggedy ass on and writes a letter to Porter's home church, and it reads, "There has been no problem of the occurrence that plagued Father Porter in the past. But during these assignments and after he was released, Porter continued to abuse young boys for more than 20 years. He later pled guilty to molesting 28 children, but he went on to tell a reporter that he abused upward of 100. But by 1971, Fight had determined that he was done with the life of priesthood. But unlike being in prison, he wasn't forced to stay in the church as his punishment. So he went on to request dispensation from his obligations as a priest and as a member of the church. So he was allowed to leave priesthood freely. And this is around the time when Father O'Brien wrote the police chief in McAllen stating, "I have just received notice that John Fight left Denham Springs, New Mexico, and is now living in the Chicago area. He is seeking employment as a layman and will no longer function as a priest. This was his own decision and was not due to a problem. If any further information is needed, please feel free to call upon me." So once he left the church, he was living life as a normal man. He married a Hispanic woman he met in New Mexico, and they went on to have 3 children. He worked a few jobs here and there selling insurance, and he moved around a bit before settling in Phoenix in 1979. This is where his older brother was living and working as a priest. He also worked for decades at the Catholic Food Bank in Scottsdale. So with Father John Fight out of the picture, the investigation into Irene Garza's murder just faded away. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to Father Dale Tashney. So when Father Fight was sent to his monastery, he was told by his supervisor that he needed to counsel Father Fight because he had killed a woman, and he needed to know if Fight would be a good fit to become a monk. Like, wait a minute. Y'all knew that whole time that he had murdered somebody, and you still try to decide if he would be fit to become a monk instead of deciding if he would be fit to go to prison? Oh, brother. So over the course of many months, Fight admitted to killing a woman in her 20s. So Father Dale asked him this obvious question, why he was in the monastery and not in prison. And Father Fight answers by saying, "The church protected me." So this is what he tells Father Dale. Fight tells him that he had heard a woman's confession, took her blouse off, and fondled her breast. Then he forced her into the rectory's basement. Father Dale said that he assumed that Father Fight had bound and gagged the woman in order to get her into the basement. But later that evening, Father Fight said that he took the woman to the pastoral house where they lived, and before leaving for Mass the next day, which was Easter Sunday, Fight says that he put the woman in the bathtub and he left her there. He says that as he was walking away, he could hear the woman say, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." Father Fight didn't exactly tell Father Dale what was causing Irene to not be able to breathe, but Father Dale speculated that he probably put a bag over her head or something, causing her to suffocate. But he goes on to say that when he returned later on that day, the woman was dead. So he dumped her body on the side of the road, and then he goes on to say that on the way to dump her body, he patted her breast even though he knew she was dead and told her, "Irene, everything is going to be okay." In this letter that Father Dale wrote, he says that Father Fight never gave the entire name of the victim, or the location of the murder, but he thought the murder took place between 1961 or 1963, and it happened in San Antonio. And he assumed the cause of death was suffocation. In this letter, Father Dale also wrote that Father Fight admitted to him that the sound of the woman's high heels clicking on the ground would trigger him to attack her from behind. And according to Father Dale, Fight said that he had a sexual compulsion to attack women from behind, especially when he kneeled behind them in church. And Father Dale's reasoning for never telling anybody what Father Fight had admitted to him, he says is because he felt his only job was to counsel the man within the parameters of the church orders. Oh, okay. So he finally decided to come forward lifetimes later because of the guilt he felt, and he said he wanted the victims' families to know what happened, and so that he can clear his conscience. So at the time of Father Dale writing this letter to the San Antonio police, it had been so many years and so many new people coming into the police department. The current officers that were reading the letter had no idea about Irene's death. But the Texas Rangers did. So in November of 2002, Dale met with one of the Texas Rangers named Ranger Hamilio. And after hearing all the details that Father Fight had told Tashni, the ranger was positive that he was talking about Irene Garza's murder. So this ranger goes on to speak with Father O'Brien, who finally admitted that Father Fight had confessed to him all those years ago. And the confession to Father O'Brien had details that were very similar to Father Dale's. And then Father O'Brien goes on to tell the ranger that in the summer of 1960, following Irene's murder, Fight was facing charges for the attack of Maria Garea. So he had traveled down to McAllen to talk to Fight, and he said he was able to apply enough pressure that Father Fight finally admitted that he had murdered Irene. Father O'Brien claims that he didn't go to police because he didn't want to embarrass the church, or for Father Fight's raggedy ass to sue him for slander? Really? That's what you was worried about, old man? So now in the face of all this evidence, including the testimony of 2 witnesses that heard Father Fight's confession about the murder, the DA still refused to take this evidence to a grand jury. The district attorney at the time, who was Rene Granetta, didn't believe that Father Fight ever confessed anything to Father Dale. And on top of that, he thought that Father O'Brien's story couldn't be trusted. He would go on to coldly say, "Why would anybody be haunted by her death? She died. Her killer got away. I'll prosecute this case when pigs fly." This is like a triple slap and a spit in the family's face, because not only did you refuse to prosecute this man way back when y'all knew what he did all that time ago, but now that y'all have this information and evidence and witnesses to corroborate that Father Fight was the one that killed Irene, which we already knew, y'all still aren't going to prosecute him. So it wasn't until 2 years later in 2004, and with the help of some heavy pressure from the community, the DA finally decided to bring this evidence to a grand jury in the attempt to indict Father John Fight. But unfortunately, the grand jury determined that there wasn't enough evidence to indict the former priest. It wasn't until more years passed, and in April of 2014, CBS aired an hour-long 48-hour episode about Irene Garza's murder. They alleged that Fight was Irene's killer and that his past had finally caught up to him. This episode generated an outpouring of support for the Garza family and the public's outcry for the arrest of John Fight. It was around this time when a new district attorney by the name of Ricardo Rodriguez was voted into office for McAllen. Rodriguez had actually used Irene's cold case as a platform in his campaign, and with the support of the Garza family, Rodriguez promised to reopen Irene's case. So following his win, he made good on his campaign promise, and he oversaw the arrest and indictment for John Fight. So on February 9th, 2016, 83-year-old John Fight was arrested in Scottsdale Retirement Community for the murder of Irene Garza. And on November 28th, 2017, 57 years after Irene's murder, a jury for Fight's trial had been selected. But due to the amount of time that had passed between Irene's murder and the trial, majority of the prosecution's evidence was hearsay. They didn't really have any physical evidence left, but they did have the testimony of many witnesses. So in order to show Fight's predatorial and unsettling behavior towards women, The prosecution had multiple witnesses to testify. One of the witnesses was a woman named Tilly Sanchez. She testified that in March of 1960, she was 21 years old and worked as a cook and a cleaner for the church. So she testified about multiple uncomfortable encounters with Fight. And the court also heard the testimony of Beatrice Garcia, who also had an uncomfortable and disturbing interaction with Fight on April 10th, 1960. This was just days before Irene's murder. So on this day, Beatrice was walking to work in downtown McAllen, which was close to the church, and as she crossed the street, Fight pulled up alongside of her in his car. When she asked him if he needed something, Fight answered back by saying, "I would love to take a picture of you dressed in black by the cemetery." And come to find out, all the women that had unpleasant encounters with Fight, Irene, Maria, Tilly, and Beatrice, they all shared similarities. They were all young, beautiful, Hispanic or Latino women. So this man definitely had a type, and I guess he had some sort of itch to scratch because he was attacking women all around the time frame when Irene went missing. Now the prosecution argued that these three women had been the lucky ones, stating these women are proof that John Fight was released from his cage and was ready to attack. The prosecution relied heavily on the stories of Father Dale and Father O'Brien to fill in the details of how Irene was killed and dumped. And according to the prosecution, police were suspicious of Fight in the first place because, for one, he was the last person to see Irene alive. Two, he had admitted that that slide gear that they found in the canal was his. And three, he had scratches on his hands and gave several inconsistent stories. And as a result of that, the Catholic Church covered up the disappearance and murder of Irene and then made a deal with the then DA Robert Lattimore back in the 60s. So Fight's defense argued that all of the prosecution's evidence was hearsay. Okay, we already knew that. And that they didn't have any evidence that positively linked John to the crime. Also, that there was no evidence of foul play in the pastoral house or rectory. Also, that trace evidence from the car Fight was using was not linked to Irene or Fight. And his shoes hadn't been taken for comparison against the cast of shoe print collected from the canal bank. His defense also said that Father Dale and Father O'Brien's stories were false, stating that the ranger fed the two of them facts just so that he can close the case. His defense also tried to argue that the prosecution's timeline was wrong, and that Irene couldn't have been attacked at 7 p.m. because witnesses said that they saw Irene in the church at different times. So Fight declined to testify on his own behalf, stating, quote, "It was a wrestling match between my vanity and common sense prevailed." So with that, both sides rested and a jury deliberated for 7 hours. And finally, on December 8th, 2017, a grand jury reached a verdict. Old ass, wrinkly ass, little turtle face John Fight was found guilty of murder with malice. And the next day, at the age of 85, he was sentenced to life in prison. Like, life? Like, come on now. He's already lived his entire life. Thanks to y'all. But Irene's parents had long since passed away and they didn't get to see justice for her. But 2 years after he was found guilty in December of 2019, he filed an appeal listing 11 grounds of error. But before the appellate court could respond to his appeals, on February 11th, 2020, guess what? They found his old ass unresponsive in his cell, so at the age of 87, he was pronounced dead in a hospital from a cardiac arrest. I told y'all this always happens. It made absolutely no sense at all why it took 57 years to convict this man when they knew from day one that he was the one that did it. But y'all, I'm gonna hurry up and wrap this one up because it was super long, wasn't expecting this, but I hope y'all enjoyed this case and I'll see you guys back here same time, same place next week.
That's what it's all about. Guns